Okay, let's have a quick look at Tuckman's model. As I say, it was 1965. It came out of this paper, and basically what it was, Tuckman did this analysis of 50 different groups to see whether he could see any similarities in the development of the groups. The groups were largely social groups and therapy type groups. He was a psychologist, so they tended to come from that kind of arena. There were one or two work groups in there from organizations, but in those days, the whole team thing, whilst teams were obviously happening, wasn't quite as big in the research as it is these days. And he in his paper acknowledges a series of weaknesses with what he's doing. And one of the weaknesses is largely their social and therapy groups. So anyway, and this was the model. Most people have come across it, the idea that there's a period of forming where people are coming together, starting to work out how they're going to work together. Then there's a period of some form of conflict where they're starting to negotiate their values. Sometimes there's positioning conflict, could be in terms of expertise, could be in terms of hierarchy. There's a whole series of different things that are involved in the conflict stage or the storming stage. Then after that stage, what he's saying is that there's a form of norming where the group start to coalesce and culture starts to emerge where there's a set of norms. And then after that process, then they really start to perform. Now, what he wasn't saying was up until then, is that no work getting done. There is work getting done, but they tend not to be aligned and working together too well until the norming has occurred. And that's what he was saying. And again, just remember, this was a study of 50 groups and his observations of a whole series of groups as well. In 1977, he did a revalidation. So we're talking, 10, 12 years later. He did a revalidation with another researcher of his model because it had become quite famous at that point. They added this adjourning level to it, in as much as few teams of groups stay together forever. They tend to break up eventually. And then there's a phase here of adjourning. In some models, it's become known as mourning, but actually that wasn't the terminology that he used. He used just the adjourning. But there was an element in here of mourning if it was a good group, if they'd already normed and they were performing. That's the model. So what we tend to see in practice, particularly in group development sessions where a consultant goes into an organization, talks about team development and things, we tend to see either that model, that's the most common model, or this model. And there was a study done, which I'll talk about a little bit later, showed that roughly somewhere between 25% and 16% of models that are used in industry today is the Tuckman model, but by far the most popular, by far. And 25%, there are there's been reports that there are over 250 different group development models. Now, I've seen this in a couple of papers. Unfortunately, they don't list them because this number suddenly appears. It's a strangely round number. So what we're going to be doing next year is starting how we're doing the thing with the leadership styles. We're going to do the same thing with the group development models. There's 5 main types, which isn't part of today's session, but there's 2 papers coming out that we'll be sending out. There's this paper, which is, let's have a look at how valid Tuckman is. And then there's another paper, which will be about the main types and examples of the main types of models, which will be useful as well. What I've seen, and this is virtually entirely in the practitioner domain, it is not in the research domain, this idea that Tuckman is not valid. I'd come across very few papers that even challenge Tuckman these days for a number of very good reasons. But in the practitioner domain, particularly coming out of kind of project management, agile project management, seems to be this idea that Tuckman's been disproved or something. And these are the papers that I've come across. There's 6 of them that are most commonly cited as evidence that Tuckman isn't valid. So I'm just going to very quickly go through and have a look at what those are. The first one, I'm just going to skip this first one and come back to it at the end. This is the most frequently cited reason that Tuckman isn't valid and therefore we shouldn't be using it. If you were to take the paper at face value, it seems to be evidence that there's no storm, basically, is what it's saying. So the Couchman study, let's just have a quick look at this. So this is a later study, 2015. It's probably the second most cited study against Tuckman, but it isn't. Firstly, it's only a small-scale study. It's about 14 people in one organization who are moving about different teams. And the only finding of this study is that knowing about Tuckman's model doesn't actually lead to any increase in ability to be able to manage and deal with teams, or the team's sense of self-efficacy, their confidence as a team. That's the only finding this paper has got. And it's not saying
It's valid.
there's no challenge in this paper whatsoever about Tuckman's validity. Nothing. Or any other forms of change either. Because when you think about it, Tuckman's model and all the other models of group development are actually models of change, about human change in groups or teams. But it does raise a question for educators and trainers. Bear in mind, it's a very small scale study. And that is, what is the practical use of teaching these models? Because just teaching the model on its own, according to this study, and I've seen one or two others, doesn't actually do anything on its own unless you do something else with it. But that's all this study is saying, is that there is no direct challenge in here whatsoever of Tuckman. Why it keeps being quoted, I've got no idea. The Bone Bright study, this is a larger study. It's actually a kind of a meta-analysis come historical review. What Denise Bonebright was doing was she was going back, this was 10, 40 years of storming, and it was a kind of a review of the literature up to 2008 when she then started writing the paper. Again, there's absolutely no direct challenge whatsoever to Tuckman in here. And again, why this is being referenced, I've got no idea. The only thing that is in here is a reference to one study, which is called the Cassidy study. What Bonebright says about this is, Cassidy conducted a study to explore the extent to which Tuckman's 1965 model adequately describes group development outside of the therapy context. Okay, that's exactly what we're looking for. She studied a sample of group development models published between 1990 and 2001 and found that they all fit into Tuckman's 5-stage framework. But again, I'm completely nonplussed as to why anybody is referencing this as an argument against Tuckman. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And in fact, Bonebright makes the point here, says one of the strengths of Tuckman model is, firstly, its ease. It's very easy for people to understand and get it, particularly at a practitioner level within organizations, that it's practical and common sense. People can get it. It makes a lot of sense. And Bonebright, she makes this, the final point really is that there's a real utility for providing a simple, accessible starting point for a conversation about the key issues of group dynamics within any form of team. So it's kind of saying the opposite of, again, I'm completely flummoxed as to why this would have ever been referenced as a criticism of Tuckman. It's saying exactly the opposite. Bizarre. Then we go to Rickards and Modger. I love that name. It's a study from 2000. This has also appeared as a direct challenge to Tuckman's model of group development, but it's a bit of an exaggeration. What they say is this. They say the stages are today regarded as idealized, they're icons because they're so famous. And that's to say that the stages may have considerable face validity as a general sequence, which it does. And we'll come back to this idea of face validity in a minute. However, empirical observations of specific teams reveal complexities that cannot be explained as a simple stage sequences. What they're saying is teams may never attain a norm or performance, and that's true. And Tuckman actually acknowledges this. Just because we've got the stages doesn't mean all teams go through all of the stages. Quite a lot of them get stuck in the storm and they don't progress. And he actually acknowledged that. And the thing that this study then added was they may even also regress to an earlier stage of development. And that can happen particularly if there's a new stressor occurs on the team. And there's a lot of research showing that teams can actually go backwards. So they may be norming at a particular point. There may be some crisis in the organization, or there's a reorganization. Half the team gets moved out, which is a crisis for any team. and then they go back. And again, Tuckman never made the assertion that all teams do all of the stages or that they're not going to go back. He didn't actually talk about regression. He didn't say this is the only way forward. In fact, when you read the bit of his limitations, he's very circumspect about the model. And he's just saying, look, this is just a model, guys. It's not the truth. But we'll come back to that. This one is interesting. This is Gersick. What Gersick did was introduce a couple of papers that introduced a new type of model of group development. It's called a punctuated equilibrium model, and it's based on evolutionary theory. What we've found in terms of evolution is that we tend not to progress just at a steady stage, and evolution doesn't just happen at a steady stage. What happens is there's huge periods of nothing in terms of development, very little development, or very slow incremental development that you'd hardly ever notice. And then sudden short bursts of development, largely because there's some kind of environmental change or something occurs. So she developed the punctuated equilibrium model. Now, what the model does show, and there's a number of papers that Gersick was involved in. So she wrote this 88 paper and then a series of others, basically showed that rather than a continual progression through the stages, there's long periods of inertia with no development, punctuated by concentrated or revolutionary periods of change. And their observations were exactly that. And this was followed up by some research by Chang and a whole group of other researchers in 2003, 2006. And they were empirical studies. And they found this. What they found was Gersick is correct. Things tend to be lumpy in terms of development. It's not just a steady stream. But, and I'll just quote what they say here, is that they found that, so this is their summary, phase models such as Gersick, this is known as a phase model because they go through phases, and stage models such as Tuckman are complementary to Gersick's model. And what they conclude is results of this study supported the hypothesis, firstly, that both punctuated equilibrium and linear progression was observed simultaneously in all project teams that they observed. And it was a large study. So it's not either or, it's both. So they do progress through a series of stages, but it's not just like a steady progression. It's lumpy. And there'll be periods. And the thing that makes the difference, which is, I wasn't actually going to cover this, but it's interesting. What happens is that they're either focused in phase one, so it's a two-phase model. In phase one, they're focused on getting the work done. So they're focused on the work, the tasks, and all the rest of it. And then as they're starting to progress through that, they start to realize that maybe this isn't the most effective way of doing this, that the team may be not working probably as effectively as it could do together. There are things not quite working. And then what they then do is shift into a period of looking at the process. So this idea of task and process. Then they look at the process, they rejig the team a bit. They say, okay, we need to do these things in order to make the flow better within the team. That's when we get that sudden shift. And then they move back to a period of equilibrium again. And it's the move from task to process. And that's what the punctuated equilibrium model is. But it works with the stage models. Again, I'm a bit confused as to why that would ever be seen as a challenge to Tuckman. And there's some bits that have been left out of the model in practitioner terms that were part of it, as well as the stages that Tuckman was talking about, the forming, storming, norming, performing stages. Tuckman also mentioned these. He talked about orientation to task, which is starting to sound very much like the punctuated equilibrium model. Didn't talk about process so much, but when you look at it, he was talking about 4 stages of task activity in any group, that there was an orientation towards the task, that there was an emotional response to the task demand, there was an open exchange of relevant interpretations. So where people are shifting beliefs and values and saying, hang on, no, that's not what I'm seeing. And that there is eventually, if they get out of that stage, an emergence of solutions. And you can see why Cheng and all the rest of them are saying that these, punctuated equilibrium and the stage models are actually they're part of the same thing. And a lot of people either don't know that about Tuckman or it's got lost in the midst of time somewhere. And then he says there are 4 phases. So he isn't talking about phases of group structure, testing independence, that there's some form of intergroup conflict, which he ended up terming storming. Then there's a development of group cohesion and a functional role relatedness, which is performing. And they were the terms that he originally used that then became forming, storming, norming, performing. But for some reason, just the terms, the labels have stuck, and a lot of people have ignored this bit. So let's just go back to this last one. This is Runkle, which is 1971. It's a bit of a red herring, this one. And it really isn't a challenge to Tuckman. This was a study that was conducted in classrooms, all right? In classroom conditions. It was a series of experiments. So it was empirical. And it was really conducted to answer one question, I suppose, which was, do human groups go through predictable stages during their history? Which is, if they found that they don't, then we've got a good challenge here. And in particular, their secondary hypothesis or question was, as a group carries out a task, must it proceed sequentially through certain stages of activity? And they were particularly, bearing in mind, we're only 6 years after Tuckman, they were looking at whether this is true. And this is their conclusion. Again, why this has become a challenge to the Tuckman model, I don't know. What they did find that was a divergence was that the conflict can occur at different points. Now, when you go back into their data, again, it was fairly small numbers and it was based on a particular group within one particular class. What they discovered was that conflicts can keep re-erupting, if you want, which we all know if you've ever worked in a team or a group. And a conflict doesn't mean that people are at each other's throats or anything. It can just be, this isn't how I see it. That's seen as a conflict. So let's now turn to this study. This is the most frequently cited reference about Tuckman and basically saying that the model isn't valid. So let's have a look at its claims. The first thing to note about it is that it was actually an internal conference paper. It wasn't a properly published paper. It wasn't ever published in any journal, and it's not peer reviewed. So nobody's looked at this. It was done by somebody with a PhD within the US military, within the US Navy, and they've got a thing called the Acquisition Corps, which I'm assuming are kind of project managers who buy things in and bring things into the military. It doesn't exactly explain that. When you have a look at it, and again, this is why I say seems only to be a concern that's cropped up amongst practitioners, and it's certainly not an issue within the research. It's actually only got 5 citations, so researchers aren't particularly taking it seriously, and there's a number of very good reasons. So their primary finding, and this is the thing that is referenced that says Tuckman isn't valid. Their primary finding was this: their teams didn't storm. There was absolutely no conflict. And Knight actually says, this is a direct challenge to Tuckman. It doesn't work. It's not like this. We've had to knock storming out of our model. So we've got forming, norming, and performing. And that was it. Let's just have a little look at the study, because the conditions of the study are really important. So the data came from a mid-career development course within the Acquisition Corps within the US Navy. So they run these courses. These people who are on the courses, the students, are midway through their career, and this is a gateway course. So it's not just a course to be better. If you don't pass, your career's staying where it is, and you only get one shot at this. So it's important, and your career depends on it. And she makes the point in her paper that the people who come on it are ambitious. She actually uses those words. And in her words, it's this: passing the course earns a certain level of certification, and this is important, within the Acquisition Corps. And since certification levels are tied to career advancement opportunities, students generally take their teaming activities seriously and are motivated to work well together. Well, it goes on a little bit more than this. It's not just motivated to work well together, right? So they had to pass this assessment. But part of the assessment was how well they work as a team. And then a researcher comes along and asks a question: have you got any conflict in your team? And this was the question that they asked. And they're in an assessed situation that the rest of their career depends on. What are they going to say? Yeah, a load of conflict. I hate him. Where are you going with that one? Because you're being assessed on team development. It's just nuts. And when I got down into the nitty-gritty of the study, what I found was that the teamwork on this course comprised of this. There were individual team projects, but they were working with other people. But the projects lasted from between 1 to 20 hours of team interactions. So 20, just think about that, 20 hours. We're probably talking about 3 or 4 days of normal interaction time. So what's going on here? It takes time for the storm to do. When you get to meet somebody at first, we go through this polite phase, and you don't go up to somebody and go, I don't like your theories about this, or there's usually conflict at first because and that's what Tuckman was saying, was that in the forming stage, there's a politeness and people are moving around each other. And it's not until they really get going that we get something. But we don't need to turn to Tuckman for this. There's an empirical longitudinal study by researchers from the University of Pennsylvania and Cornell University. We're talking about decent researchers here in the US that found that interpersonal conflict, storming by Tuckman's definition, only tends to arise in work teams sometime after the initial stage of group formation and usually towards the midpoint of a team's life. And how they define that is this, and this is the quote. The team in their study, their longitudinal study, spent an average of 10.8 hours a week working on a project, and individuals spent an average of 20.6 hours a week on the project. And this was why it was a longitudinal study, over 12 to 14 weeks duration, which quite a lot of teams. Teams very rarely are just a day and then they break up again. And this means that conflict was only ever identifiable after week 5 or after about 50 to 60 hours of team interaction. So it takes roughly about 50 to 60 hours of team interaction for conflicts to start to rise on average. And given that the night study participants only had a maximum of 20 hours, we're not even at a phase where that would even be recognized. But anyway, by the by. So to say it's flawed is an understatement, and it is not showing in any way that I can see that Tuckman is invalid. And I can find no credible evidence that Tuckman's model isn't valid. So does that mean Tuckman's model therefore is valid? Not quite. The trouble with a model like this is you can't actually validate it at a general level. You would have to run it through thousands of teams and in lots of different. And it has actually been, when you look at all of the studies together that say, yeah, this works, it's been run lots of times. And from a research point of view, it is seen as valid. But let's have a look at what that means. And this is about the nature of models. There's a general appreciation within research of this. All models are wrong. They're just a model, right? And there's this beautiful paper by Box from 1976, and the paper's called Science and Statistics. It's a really good paper. It's a bit mathematical. If you're into maths, you'll enjoy it. If you're not, then read between the bits. But he makes this assertion, all models are wrong, and then he backs it up. So let's have a look at what we're talking about here. And you can see his citations, like this paper's referenced liberally. I wish I had a citation record like this, 2,000 plus references. Let me explain something about models. Right. So this is some data from a study that was done earlier this year. What it was looking at was on the left axis here, on the vertical axis, what we've got here is the level of facilitator interactions by teachers. And what we mean by this, so higher up means that they're asking more questions, more coachy type interactions by drawing things out of the students. And further down, what they're doing is they're teaching more. So more kind of front loading stuff. So that's on this axis. And on this axis is the level of autonomy that the teachers have over the interactions and what was going on in the classroom, and to some extent syllabus. Okay, so just ignore this line at the moment, but you look at the data, it's all over the place. But when you run it through a stats package, we get a line of best fit and a line of regression. So that is a model. So what we're saying here is What this model is saying is the more autonomy a teacher, lecturer, facilitator has in the activities that they can run with their students. So rather than the organization saying, here, just deliver this, run this at this time, run this at that time, the more autonomy they have, the more likely they are to facilitate and less likely to teach. The less autonomy they have, the more likely they are to teach. So as a model, it is accurate. That's exactly what seems to be going on. As a trend, there is that trend. It's not all the time. It's just a model. It's a model of best fit. So we have this model that says, yeah, this is true. And in fact, that's what this paper was saying. As a model, the more autonomy you give people, the more likely they are to facilitate. The less autonomy you give them, the less likely they are to facilitate. But it doesn't mean that it's universally true. It's just a model. Normal distribution. It's just a model. Normal distributions don't happen in nature. In order to get to a normal distribution, we've got to kill some data and add some data. It's just a model. You don't see it in nature like this. It's not as smooth. So let me give you some examples of this. Okay. It doesn't matter what the data is. There's a distribution there. You can see it. You can see the pattern, but you can see the differences here are massive. So just because it's a model doesn't mean it's accurate. And again, we see here, this is some more data that would suggest that if whatever was going on here, and I can't remember what this study's from, but if you were to rely on the model to make a prediction about what was going on here, it would be wrong. Because it's just a model. And it's a bit like maps. And this is how I view it, is this is a map of Oxford, which is fine if you're trying to get to Oxford and you're just on the outskirts. It's not that great if you're trying to find a particular place within Oxford because it's not detailed enough. So as a model, it's all right for one thing, it's not great for the other. This is a street map of Oxford. That's better if you're trying to find the Radcliffe Camera, for example, which happens to be my reading room, or the Bodleian Library. Great, but there's a whole load of stuff that isn't on there. You're going to have to struggle a bit. You have to go in. That's why when we get to maps and we're trying to navigate, we get to more detail or it pulls out. These are other types of maps. They're all models and they're great for particular purposes. This model here is a map of Oxford. It shows that Oxford sits in a basin. It's a 3D relief map and that it's on a gravel plain, but it isn't going to get you to the Bodleian Library. But it's interesting and it's useful if you're a geologist or an archaeologist. And the same here. This is actually a map of where all the stone came from, All Souls College in Oxford, which, by the way, is the only college that doesn't have any students. I know, a bit bizarre. They're all research fellows, so it's a research college. So useful if you're interested in the history of All Souls College and you're looking at the stone and going, oh, okay, that looks different from that. Fine. But again, if you want to actually get to All Souls College, it's not going to do it. Is all models are wrong, but in effect, models are usually good enough to be useful in a particular context. And what I mean by that is this. Every model is an approximation of reality. It's not reality at a level of abstraction for a particular purpose. There is no generally valid model of any type. A model can only be validated in a particular context. So if it fits in the context and it's useful, then it's fine. And the question is this model valid in this context? You can't have a model that's valid in every context. They're just an approximation of reality. And it's whether it fits for our purpose and our context. And what Box says is all models are wrong, but the key issue is it useful? Even though we know it's not real, if it's useful to help us think about this, to do something with it, then that's fine. And that brings us back to the whole Tuckman thing. You can't actually validate Tuckman. You can invalidate it in certain contexts. So if you've got people who've been working together for years and they're really good, they're military and they're a tight-knit team, Tuckman's not going to apply. But what we're looking at from a face validity and a respondent validity point of view is Tuckman applies in lots and lots of conditions. So I shall stop there